This is your host of CivilNet, Eric Hacopian, and we're honored to have as our guest today Professor Nerses Kopalyan from UNLV in Las Vegas. Professor Kopalyan is a professor of political science with his expertise on international relations and specifically on the post-Soviet states. Professor Kopalyan, thank you for taking the time for joining us in such a late hour.
My pleasure.
Recently, and this is what triggered this interview actually, is you wrote this very interesting article in AVN report about the need for a truth commission about what happened in the Artsakh War. Obviously, you're not the only one. There's many people who are calling out for this. But I think the article that you wrote was very good, but it was very academic. I want to see if you can explain this to layman's terms. What would this entail and what would it really look like?
Sure. So, in a lot of societies where you've had issues of post-conflict resolution, post-war resolution, or even sort of domestic instability, truth commissions have been utilized as a mechanism that could lead to both social reconciliation and also sort of provide answers to a lot of unclear developments that took place during these periods of crises. So in the case of Armenia, the discussion of a truth commission is specific in this context to the 2020 war that we recently had, the four-day war that we had over Artsakh. And there have been sort of these persistent questions about what went wrong, how long had these problems been around, were they systemic, were they not systemic, whose fault is it, right? Is it the current government, or is it an extensive problem that includes the current government but also manifests in the behavior of the previous government, so on and so forth. So sort of you have these little general sort of rhetorical questions, sort of soul-searching questions that society is asking, but there are also very concrete, direct issues pertaining to socio-political responsibility for accountability and transparency. So those are the general themes that kind of drive truth commissions. As far as sort of simplifying what a truth commission entails or what it could look like for Armenia, there are a multitude of mechanisms that have been utilized within various countries for effective, what we call robust truth commissions. And what Armenians would look like could take on a multitude of forms. But fundamentally, at the most basic level, it would be a sort of an ad hoc, a non-judicial thing, fact-finding mission that is mandated by Parliament, that is mandated by law, where this commission is given extensive powers of search and seizure, of subpoenaing witnesses, and is provided all the instruments to investigate and find answers to all the pertinent questions that we are posing. So a truth commission basically would engage in this very broad fact-finding missions to provide transparency, and after that, they would provide these sort of broad set of policy recommendations on how the systemic errors or how the systemic problems that were prevalent could be resolved or alleviated.
Thank you, Professor Kopalyan. That was a very good explanation as far as the people understanding the basics. One thing that I wanted to ask you is, obviously there are other examples of this. We know about the Truth Commission in South Africa to study the crimes of apartheid. And we know of other similar things that have to do with military failures. I mean, Israel had the Winograd Commission. So the Truth Commission is sort of an encompassing thing. It does not necessarily, because we're studying the failures of war rather than something like, the crimes of apartheid. Can you talk a little bit about the other examples that are relevant to us that can be the benchmark that we judge ourselves by?
Sure. So in specific instances of having truth commissions for war, these vary from country to country. One aspect to consider is the level of institutionalization and development of the given country. So developed countries, for example, highly institutionalized countries, utilize truth commissions in a different fashion than relatively developing countries such as Armenia. So you brought up the example of Israel. Israel's military obviously was one of the more powerful ones in the region, even back then. But the reigning question was, Why did Israel have an intelligence failure? Why did they not see the war coming? And so a truth commission was put together to kind of unravel these sort of questions, to kind of deconstruct the flaws that were prevalent and thus lead to alterations or changes in their system, in their military system, that would avoid such developments in the future. For the case of Armenia, the model cannot be replicated, but there are obviously best practices that would work as well. For the United States, for example, in the United States, you don't have truth commissions, but you have something similar where you have sort of these independent councils or special councils or Senate sort of hearings that try to unravel developments. You had this extensive one, for example, over Benghazi. They tried to find out, obviously it was politicized, but they tried to engage in a fact-finding mission, or that was a purpose. You had several of these trying to inquire what went wrong with Vietnam, so on and so forth. So the whole underlying the discourse is, what is the objective of the given truth commission? Is it something where the government is trying to find out what happened in of itself, which is usually technical and specific to institutions, or is something that's broader, which includes these variables, as well as answering the concerns of society?
Well, I think you touched on the key word that I was going to be the basis of my next question, which was political. Obviously, anything of this nature is distinctly and completely political, no matter how depoliticized you try to make it, because it has very succinct and exact political repercussions. And I can tell you, with my experience with politics and government, is most elected officials hate anything of this nature because far more bad is going to come out of it than good for their purposes. Obviously, this is going to take a lot of public pushing to make this happen, because there are forces that will do everything in their power to either not allow this to come together, or if it comes together, it is something that is defanged as far as the reach that it has. Tell me about two things. One is, what is the politics of this? What will it look like? Who's likely to win, who's likely to lose, which I think will actually affect the likelihood of this coming about. And secondly, one of the reasons that I have been pushing for this is, from what I understand, if we manage to put something like this together, it would be a first in the post-Soviet space. I'm not talking about studying the Stasi in East Germany. I'm talking about the post-Soviet states. I don't think any country has had this, and I think if Armenia can actually set up an independent commission to look at its fault, it's going to catapult us in the world of governance and democracy far above other countries. So I want to see if you can address these two issues.
Sure. With respect to your first question, the politics of this obviously are going to be sort of multifaceted, because you already have a situation that's been heavily politicized. Discourse on facts, on sort of, concrete developments, assessments of reality have been deemed secondary in the current rhetoric that we're seeing. You have a political movement in Armenia that qualifies itself as the opposition, that's attempting to basically remove the current government by virtue of politicizing the war. And so, that element that's going to view a government in their eyes that's delegitimate, or a government that is lost, lacking the mandate or the authority to orchestrate or put together a truth commission. So in essence, whatever this government does, or whatever this parliament does, the critics or the naysayers are going to inherently politicize and try to discredit whatever the findings might be. So that's one component of the politicization process. As far as the current government is concerned, we have to understand that the government in of itself is also sort of a complex with the number of institutions and complexities that it has to deal with. For example, a parliament might be very willing to do this, but you might get pushback from the military brass that views itself as an insulated institution and not part of the political infrastructure. And so two things to consider. One, sort of the power configurations of Armenia's political theater, the opposition, the current government in power, and the oppositional parties within government. And to what extent can a truth commission be depoliticized and be produced in a very unbiased structure that could to some extent mitigate the politicized concerns? So the parliament would have to go over and above any suspicions, and it would have to go out of its way to construct a truth commission that kind of addresses a lot of the concerns that we may see. But as far as the politicization component of this is concerned, especially in Armenian society, it's going to be very, very difficult to have a purely objective truth commission by virtue of the fact that this isn't going to be specific to institutions or technical aspects, but also the broader political discourse. With respect to your second question, Armenia is attempting to do something that, as you noted, has not really been done extensively in the post-Soviet space. The only example that I could think of was the 2008 Russia-Georgian War, where you had an external, the Tagliaferri Commission that came, that was sort of a UN mandated, and did an extensive sort of a dive into who started the 2008 war. What were the implications, and so on and so forth. So there was something similar to that, but we call that model a hybridity model, where you have external actors involved. But this was not in of itself instituted by Georgia or Russia, but that was some form of a truth commission that attempted to look at developments of the conflict. But I will make an important point. Even though, for example, Russia did not have a truth commission per se specifically, Russia did implement extensive military reforms after it observed and analyzed its developments during the 2008 war. You had what was called the Serdyakov reforms implemented by Russia, where they looked at the performance in 2008 and during the war, and they were just shocked how basically lackadaisical their organization was. The extent to which they had logistical and chain of command issues. And so Russia, for example, after observing these limitations, implemented important reforms. They went from basically having a divisional regimental structure, right, to a brigade structure. Russia implemented immediate reforms with respect to its military doctrine, okay? They understood that sort of this traditional mass symmetrical wars of high intensity no longer work. So they adapted sort of these more diverse modalities of asymmetrical warfare, for example. And they also proceeded to sort of implement a military infrastructure, a military doctrine that was very efficient, very mobile, that could be quickly deployed. And when, for example, Russia ended up taking over Crimea, everybody was shocked. What happened to this, army in 2008 that was relatively slow, operationally, not top-notch, all of a sudden, moving very, very quickly. And this was a byproduct of kind of, internally observing the limitations of how well they operated and implementing extensive reforms. So there are some models we can look at that has been implemented in the post-Soviet space, but not one where it was heavily had political implications as we would see if we did one with Armenia.
Well, I think what we're looking at is, I think there needs to be a push for this, because I think this is the gold standard. And the way it works in politics, even if you don't reach the gold standards, it's going to push the process of reform, which, one way or the other, as you said, the Russian military of 2008 is not the Russian military of today. And we, in fact, saw it a couple of months ago that within a matter of hours, they were already in Artsakh, something that they probably could not have done in 2006 or 2008. One of the things that is going to come up, and it's almost inevitable, and it's not even a guesswork, is, and I know you're very familiar with the Armenian military, is the issue of corruption. All of us, anyone who has lived here or followed developments, knows the stories of generals with $800 a month salaries who live in $500,000 homes. Everyone knows about the businesses that this general has here or abroad. So obviously, that corruption in the Armenian military is not a secret. And the corruption in the Artsakh military is not a secret. What can you tell us about that, and how deep do you think that culture is? And what impact did it have during the war?
For the longest time, there's been sort of this consistent theme that, corruption is a national security threat. Everybody knew it, but tackling it remains a very, very difficult phenomenon. And I've been, involved with the Army's military for the last 5 years, as far as sort of, research, visiting the front lines, being there for extended period of times. Few things stand out, and there are patterns of behavior that stand out. One, corruption was systemic at the officer level and at the upper brass level. But this modality of corruption was what we would call petty. For example, let's say you're the commander of a military base and you would skim 20% of the food that would come there, right? That would be, allocated to your base, and that would go, to a village where you have a couple of cafes or small shops or so on and so forth. So you had these sort of embezzlement and skimming operations that were part of sort of that form of corruption. And you had corruption at the upper level, where sort of generals would engage in procurement with a lot of kickbacks, or generals would have their own businesses that would provide, gasoline to the military, clothing to the military, and so on and so forth. This kind of hit its apex in 2016. When we saw the consequences of the April War, even the then President Sargsyan had to remove a couple of generals who were considered to be quote-unquote his generals because the corruption was so blatant that it actually affected the performance of the military during the 4-Day War in 2016. So we've had continuous systemic concerns as far as corruption. I'll give you a simple anecdotal example. In 2017, I was visiting the Armenia's defense ministry, and a non-Armenian colleague was with me. And, once you walk down the parking lot on the left side, you see all the vehicles of generals parked. And he had this very sarcastic look on his face where, he's like, this looks like sort of a collection of luxury vehicles. My assumption is your military spends more money on its general than it does on its rank and file. There's sort of a very obvious observation they had. It's not something that can be hidden. So these things kind of stood out. The second issue, it's the behavior is corrupt, but it doesn't qualify corrupt in the traditional sense, was the issue of nepotism and lack of meritocracy. Okay, right after the 4-Day War in 2016, I was in Artsakh, and we went to visit Askedan's military base, which was the biggest military base in Artsakh. And the commander of that military base, when we went to visit, was just basically sitting there playing solitaire on his computer, very dismissive. And the officers around him had this very awkward relationship with him. But when we left sort of the meeting, and I asked some of the officers what was going on. And they basically told me, this commander of the Askedan military base got his position because he's the president's brother-in-law. But we don't have respect for him because when the 4-Day War happened, a certain retired general walked into the military base and took command. Now, this kind of suggested that you have also issues of, personalistic leadership in the military, reputational leadership, a questionable infrastructure of chain of command, and this has been persistent. Now, to answer your sort of overarching question, to what extent did that affect the recent war? We don't know. Right? That's why we need a truth commission unravel. But there's no doubt that this culture of, perceived immunity, this culture of nepotism, this culture of internal informal networks and connections did contribute to a lot of the problems that we saw. Because in the theory of war, the military is the operational force, not the external political actors. And so when we see questionable behavior, we see underperformance, the problem isn't with the soldier. The problem is with the infrastructure, the systemic problems that have been persistent. And so, there have been consistent patterns that have been questionable to a lot of us who have been observers of the Armenian military.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question that's it's going to be quite unfair, but I think you're capable of answering it. Obviously, as you said, we need to have the commission to know what happened, and get straight answers about the failures in the war. But from your knowledge, which is extensive, and I'm gonna keep this in the context of a guess, not as facts. What would you guess if you were to give a prognostication of this commission is established? What do you think they will come back with?
I think they would come back with what has been clear to many of us scholars, but we lack the empirical data because the military is so close and you can't research or untangle our developments. They will come back and basically tell us that the failures of the 2020 Artsakh War, the military failures, were byproduct of 10 to 15 years of systemic underdevelopment, us losing the arms race, inconsistent or technically mispurchasing of military products, a lack of training, and quite clearly a problem with our officer corps. Armenia has brilliant soldiers, but it has problematic military leadership, which this war kind of showed. And anybody who's been to the front lines in the last 5 years, 10 years would tell you that you go to the front lines, you see the formation of our military infrastructure, and it doesn't make sense. Okay, you have 10, 12 boys guarding an amount of space that, if invaded by the Azeri, for example, trenches that are about 20, 30 feet away, there's no way they could defend that. Something logically was not adding up. Our security architecture never made sense. On top of that, you had sort of, commanders who, not to be sarcastic, their stomachs were bouncing off of their knees. They hadn't probably done a military operation since 1994, commanding these sort of, newly brought in soldiers. So we're going to see that this did not happen in a vacuum. Okay, these are failures that are going to be very prevalent and obvious going back 10, 15 years, all the way to the recent times. So in my honest assessment, all of the administrations are going to bear some responsibility for it. But the underlying question is, who designed, and by who I mean the military leadership, what military leaders designed the security architecture that we have today? And that's mostly going to fall on, Seydan Ohanyan and the previous military leaders who kind of put together the defensive infrastructure that had continued until September of 2020. So, not to get ahead of ourselves, not to be too presumptuous, we will see a lot of fault being laid once the evidence is unraveled on 10, 15 years of underdevelopment and systemic failures.
Thank you for that overall view of what you think this is likely to come out of it. I'm going to close with a question that is not related to this particular topic, but it is topically, it's probably the most discussed issue here, which is the issue of our POWs. And I would call them hostages at this point in the hands of the Aliyev regime. Obviously, this violates the ceasefire agreement because we were supposed to have an exchange of all prisoners. Aliyev has been bold enough to say that he's thinking about prosecuting them as terrorists, which is absurd. Almost all of these, the soldiers at least, were captured in that illegal Hadrut operation where they themselves violated the ceasefire because the lines were supposed to hold where they were at and there shouldn't be any further actions. What actions do you think are relevant that need to be taken by the government here, by our diaspora institutions, and by the international community to bring pressure on this, I would call a terrorist regime in Baku, to release our prisoners and return our civilian and military POWs?
To address the first part of your question, it's pretty obvious that Aliyev is utilizing the POW situation to sort of develop for himself a mechanism or more leverage or pressure against the government. So as far as Aliyev's sort of, geopolitical politicking is concerned, the POWs play as some kind of a negotiating card where he could utilize to potentially force any form of concession that he can from the Armenian side. Now, as far as the ceasefire violations are concerned, from the lens of their interpretation, obviously they don't think they're violating the ceasefire because they're interpreting the ceasefire in a fashion that suits their interests. So the problem here lies on the shoulders of the Russian peacekeepers or the Russian authorities, because Russia has postured itself as sort of one who's going to implement or at least referee the ceasefire. And so ceasefire violations are supposed to be monitored, clarified, and addressed by the Russian authorities at this point until the joint operations with Turkey and Ogdom come to fruit. So as far as addressing this issue, there is some pressure and responsibility that Russia itself sees as having, because if they're not able to do anything, the last thing you want to be viewed as a peacekeeper is being impotent and unable to have any force or authority. So Russian pressure here is going to be extremely important in that context. The Armenian government has no leverage with the Azeri authorities. That's a fact. And it couldn't have leverage as far as the configuration stand. But what we need to see is, I don't want to use the word hysteria, but a lot of aggressive pressure from the Armenian diplomatic corps in all the democratic countries that we have representation in to pressure these governments to get somehow involved, because what Azerbaijan is doing, in essence, is violating a lot of the principles that these governments hold. So there has to be an ideational push in a lot of the diplomatic circles to pressure Azerbaijan. We're not seeing that at that level. I think we are seeing a degree of underperformance by our diplomats as far as this issue is concerned. So between Russia doing what it's supposed to do and Armenia's diplomatic corps doing what they're supposed to do, sufficient pressure may be placed on Azerbaijan to at least tone down the rhetoric and speed up the return, because they're inevitably going to return to POWs. The question is what they can get in return. That's their objective. As far as the Armenian diaspora is concerned, listen, the 44-day war showed us that the Armenian diaspora, politically speaking, is not very strong, especially in the United States. We postured ourselves as the second most powerful ethnic lobbying organization in the United States, but we were not able to get much done politically at the federal level. We still haven't been able to see a single statement from the State Department or the executive branch directly addressing this issue. So the diaspora could continue and should continue with this sort of intense PR and getting the message out. But fundamentally, unless the diaspora is able to convince the incoming Biden administration to pressure Baku to kind of stop what it's doing, the diaspora's power remains utterly limited as far as this issue is concerned, especially in the levers of power in Washington or in Paris or whatever the case might be. So I would not put much hope on diaspora's political efficacy with the POW situation. The emphasis has to be on the Armenia's diplomatic corps and on Russia.
Well, a corollary to this, obviously you know that and everybody knows that there were extensive use of international terrorists in the war in Artsakh. And there are terrorists that will be going on trial in Armenia as criminals, essentially, because they have no protection under international law. There are captured Syrian tourists, as we know. How much do you think these POWs are being held illegally to kill those trials as an exchange?
There are two schools of thought on this topic. The one school of thought is that Baku does not feel threatened by the presence of these sort of characters in Armenian prisons because they have culpable deniability. They could qualify them as volunteers. They could qualify them as whatever they want to qualify them as. And so we can call them terrorists. They can call them volunteers who were arrested by the Armenians. And they kind of, they engage in this nonsensical discussion that, look at the Armenians. They have volunteers from other countries as well, right? So they try to draw this sort of untenable comparison, but they do it. So that's one school that says Baku isn't too concerned about that, and that they always have culpable deniability in claiming that a bunch of Syrian Turkmen, right, because these are basically ethnic Turkmen, want to come and they want to fight for their kin, more power to them. There's nothing terroristic about this, right? So sort of qualifying it in that framework doesn't work within Baku's rhetoric. So that's one school of thought. The second school of thought does attest to the fact that this could potentially be problematic. But connecting the dots between these given mercenaries or terrorists to basically Baku's intelligence services, to the government, and trying to establish that there was some policy is legally complex. is legally difficult. And so I think Baku is relatively confident and doesn't care as much in my assessment of the developments on how we legally treat these terrorists. Baku, it seems to me, is more concerned about using our POWs, which they are illegally holding as hostages, to either get more favorable demarcation issues when it comes to redrawing of the borders, or more favorable leverage when it comes to implementation of several aspects of the ceasefire, so on and so forth. I think they're looking at the bigger picture as opposed to two, terrorists or mercenaries that they could easily sugarcoat in the broader scheme of things.
Well, Professor Kopalyan, I wanted to thank you for joining us. I know it was a late hour for you, and thank you for this enlightening discussion.
Thank you for inviting me. My pleasure.
This is your host of CivilNet, Hacopian, and thank you for watching our broadcast.